Welcome to the Plant Trainers Podcast, where we're helping people improve their quality of life through nutrition and fitness. And now, your hosts, nutrition and wellness coaches, international speakers, Adam and Shoshana Chaim.
Hey, I'm Adam Chaim.
And I'm Shoshana Chaim, and we are
Propelled by Plants. Today we bring to you episode 286, Whole Food, Plant-Based with Dr. T. Colin Campbell.
In this episode of the Plant Trainers Podcast, we talk to a man who needs almost no introduction, Dr. T. Colin Campbell. He's best known for writing the China study with his son, Dr. Tom Campbell, who was in episode number 131. And of course, we took his course when we first became immersed into the plant-based living. This show is really planned by you, our listeners. You were kind enough to comment on Instagram and Facebook and share your questions. So we talked about cancer, allergies, autoimmune disease, ketosis, osteoporosis, oils, and fat. We needed to soak in as much information as we could because, of course, he's a legend, and we want you to do the same. So please share this with those who you love or even those who you like a little. Find us on Facebook and Instagram at Plant Trainers and leave a comment about what you liked best in this episode.
Dr. Campbell has been dedicated to the science of human health for more than 60 years. His primary focus is on the association between diet and disease, particularly cancer. Although largely known for the China study, one of the most comprehensive studies of health and nutrition ever conducted, and recognized by the New York Times as the Grand Prix of epidemiology, Dr. Campbell's profound impact also includes extensive involvement in education, public policy, and laboratory research. Throughout his career, he has confronted a great deal of confusion surrounding nutrition and its effects. It is precisely this confusion that he has focused so much on in recent years. Dr. Campbell co-wrote the China study, Startling Implications for Diet, Weight Loss, and Long-Term Health, which has sold more than 2 million copies worldwide. He's also the author of the New York Times bestseller Whole and the Low-Carb Fraud. Several documentary films feature Dr. Campbell and his research, including Forks Over Knives, Eating You Alive, Food Matters, and PlantPure Nation. He continues to share evidence-based information on health and nutrition whenever given the opportunity. He's delivered hundreds of lectures around the world and is the founder of the T. Colin Campbell Center for Nutrition Studies and the online Plant-Based Nutrition Certificate in partnership with eCornell.
I know exactly what you're thinking. What do I make for dinner? How am I going to get it done? How could I possibly stay so organized that I won't have to run to the grocery store midweek? How do I know what you're thinking? Because I'm always getting emails, PMs, DMs, and I even get stopped in the grocery store to be asked the same thing. So this is what I want. I want you to be the master of meal planning. Just click on the link in the show notes or go to planttrainers.com/shop and I'll walk you through how to plan, shop, and prep for a full week's worth of food so you don't have to get the takeout that makes you feel bad and bloated, so you don't have to stay up till 10 o'clock at night making a perfect meal because let's face it, that's not going to help your health either. You need to be exercising, talking to loved ones, binging on Netflix. You can choose how to spend your extra time, but you don't need to spend that extra time running to the grocery store in the middle of the week, in the kitchen, or wondering what to make. Go to planttrainers.com/shop, click on the Meal Planning Mastery link, and for $27, become a rock star.
And now for a moment of gratitude.
Our son, who's in grade 5, made the volleyball team, and I'm grateful for his opportunity to play on a team and for me to be able to watch him and cheer him on.
I'm grateful for our ongoing education in health and nutrition, and being able to share this episode and have the opportunity to talk to Dr. Campbell is really a huge privilege and honor. And I'm also grateful for the opportunity to share all that I'm learning and continue to learn with the students that I come into contact with.
Dr. T. Colin Campbell, thank you so much for being on the Plant Trainers Podcast today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. It's especially a pleasure to talk to folks like you who are out there trying to spread this message. I think one of the greatest messages in health ever told, if I could say so. So thank you for the opportunity.
No problem. We're very, very honored. And before we begin talking to you and asking you so many wonderful questions, we wanted to know if you had a moment of gratitude that you'd like to share with us and our listeners.
Yeah, well, first off, I'm having a lot of gratitude for the fact that I went to college, in graduate school. My father only had a couple of years of formal education. He was an immigrant from Northern Ireland. And my mother went to high school, but I was the first to go to college and let alone graduate school. So the position they put me in at that time, that's what I'm grateful for.
And that brought you to where you are literally sitting today.
Yeah, I've had a long career. I've been in this business. This is my 63rd year and professionally in this career. So it's been quite a while. I've seen quite a bit.
That's wonderful. And we're so grateful that you have, because the work that you have done and that you continue to do is just so important. It's science-based, it's inspirational, it's got a little bit of everything for everybody out there. And it's really one of the reasons why a plant-based lifestyle can be what it is today, because of the work that you've done.
Thank you.
So we were very excited for this interview, and we decided to put out some questions to a lot of our listeners and followers on Facebook and Instagram to see what kind of questions they had for you, because we know that you have all the answers. So we thought we'd go through a few of those today. Does that sound good to you?
Yeah, except that I don't have all the answers.
Well, the answers that you do have, we'd be happy to hear what they are. There's a lot of experts that say, with the exception of some absorption issues, that a whole food plant-based diet can work for anyone. And we wanted to know if there's anybody who you believe that a plant-based diet could not work for.
No, no, I don't. I actually think that the whole food plant-based diet is, quite frankly, a fact of nature. And it doesn't mean to say everyone's going to respond exactly the same way. That's certainly not true. But when they start this, if anything happens, it'll be good. And it's very broad-based.
So what do you have to say about people who might go plant-based and begin to lose their hair or have very big decline in energy?
I've never heard that. I've only heard the reverse. I mean, that's a new one. If they're doing it right, that's the key. And by right, I mean, using whole foods, not the parts of foods, like you find in processed foods. But the whole food itself, have good variety, that's really important. Make sure that they're adequately hydrated, that's not water. Be careful, don't be adding oil, that's added oil. Plants that have oil in them are fine, but not the added extracted oils. So if they follow those rules there, I don't think they'll have a problem. I've just not heard of that. I mean, some people will say that. I've seen it from time to time, but those people are very, very much into advocating exactly the opposite. They want to basically destroy this message, if I can say that.
For sure. I do have a lot of clients who come to me who say, I've gone plant-based before, I've gone vegan before, and it hasn't worked for me. My skin got awful and I didn't have a lot of energy. But what I usually find is that people aren't eating enough because they're not used to having to eat more quantity to be able to make up for all of the nutrients and energy that they need. So sometimes that's big. I have had people tell me before that they've lost their hair or what have you, but I'm not convinced that there's a correlation between that's something that they were sick and that would have happened no matter what. But you did mention oils there, and oils came up a lot with some of the questions that people had asked, because there's a really big movement that talks about oil for brain health and oil for skin and needing oil in our body. So can you talk a little bit towards whether or not we need to have some of these other oils as a supplement?
Yes. Actually, there's a bigger question here that I should mention, because some of the questions you sent all relate to this, in a sense, to the bigger question. Namely, when we think about nutrition for the last many decades, more than a century, we tend to think about nutrition in terms of specific foods and more particularly in terms of specific nutrients. Each of them having their special properties, affecting certain conditions and so forth and so on. That's a concept called reductionism. And that's not the way that nutrition works. That's a pharmacologic approach. And that's one of the problems that arise more often than not. People, want to hear about whether this works for this condition, that condition, some other. What we're finding is that this diet, which can be highly varied, incidentally, in terms of the specific foods consumed, just as long as whole and just as long as it is all plant-based. without adding back, as I said, oil, sugar, and salt to any extent. That's the goal. That's the goal. And for those who, in fact, want to follow a vegan diet with not too much information, a vegan diet tends not to work. I'm not talking about a vegan diet. A vegan diet, we have some really good evidence now, the largest survey ever conducted on the nutrient consumption of vegans versus vegetarians versus meat eaters. And I must tell you that the amount of fat consumed by vegans, vegetarians, and meat eaters is identical. Believe it or not, it is identical. The amount of refined sugars consumed by those three groups, identical. This is the biggest study ever done so far. It's out of England. It's based on a European survey of a lot of those groups of people. And what's really happening? People. So I don't use the word vegan. I never have, because that came along for good reasons, for ethical reasons, if you will, which is fine. But that's not why I get into this business. I'm in research, and I was just simply, and in fact, I was starting from a position of having studied and promoted, if you will, a high animal protein diet. And so when I started doing the research in a really fundamental way, it all turned out that that wasn't right. So, I gradually worked over the years toward this whole concept of whole plant-based foods. And so I don't particularly care for the vegan word or vegetarian word, to be honest about it. And those who want to follow those prescriptions, and there's lots of versions of that, if you will, too often they're still advocating the use of certain kinds of oils. Well, I say no added oils. So, as I say, I can't answer the question. I know that whole food plant-based diet has such a breadth of effect, and that's really one of the exciting concepts. Extraordinary breadth. A whole variety of illnesses and diseases and so forth and so on can not only be prevented, but actually, surprisingly, can be reversed when people already have them. That's the beauty of the whole food plant-based diet. And it doesn't necessarily, we don't like to focus on one thing at a time, or like one nutrient or one mechanism or one disease. That's typical. That's the traditional way of thinking about nutrition. I don't agree with that. And I'm writing a new book, basically, to elaborate on that point, talking in particular about why this hasn't really been heard this way before. But some of my colleagues and friends and so forth, they put people on, for example, on a vegan diet to see if they can reverse heart disease. It doesn't work. They may get some benefits, yes, but they don't get the full benefits. Sorry for that long answer, but it's, for me, critical because it tends to relate to a lot of more specific kinds of questions.
No, I think the long answer is definitely good because I think people need to understand, because we have a lot of people who are taking omega-3s and hemp oils and flax oils. But I think what you're saying is if you're going to be eating a whole food plant-based diet, but you're going to include hemp seeds in there and nuts in there, then we're going to be getting, and avocados and all of those good sources of fats, then we're going to be getting enough fats, and there's going to be enough natural oils within those foods to allow the body to function the way that it's supposed to function. Is that correct?
Yes, you said it very well. On average, the amount of fat that should be present in the diet, and recommended, if you will, is about 10% of total calories, maybe 12 or so. Just the amount that's present in whole plant-based foods. And that's enough. That's enough. We need fat, by the way. Fat is, of course, an essential nutrient. We need protein, but the protein should be coming from plant sources, not animal sources, of course. And most of all, for most of the calories, we need carbohydrate. But that's the typical, traditional, very natural composition of plant-based foods.
And what about children? Should the percent of calories coming from fat be higher for children than for adults?
No, it turns out that in the very young, the research tends to show that when they're infants and they're nursing and so forth and so on, mother's milk, which is the most perfect food, by the way, I'm sure you probably agree with that, that's supplying the infant with all the nutrients they really need. And it may be higher in fat and so forth. That's just nature at work. But once the child comes off the breast and then starts eating regular food, they should be eating the same kind of food as their adults do, as their parents do. There's no need to be adding this. That's another reductionist idea that came out of the past. That just because somebody discovered that, a little more fat was associated with, let's say, whatever benefit they might see, okay, then they recommend it and they want to sell it. That's where the problem arises. I don't mean to say that occasionally some of these supplements might work on some people, and here's the rationale for that. If people are not consuming a whole food plant-based diet, which means about 95% of the people, if they're just using the traditional diet, at that point in time, they've already put themselves at some level of risk, more so with some nutrients than others, let's say. Under those circumstances, then if you take a supplement, on occasion, you can see what might look like a benefit for a while. But what that really is nothing more than sort of minimizing the harmful effects already existing. But if they go to a whole food plant-based diet and stay there and just become accustomed to it and like it, then there's no need for these kind of supplements.
Got it. That sounds good to us. Okay, another question that came up has to do with eczema and allergies. And we know from our experience, before we were even in the health coaching business, we were dealing with our son's eczema, which was so bad around the eyes that he had bleeding everywhere. We found out that he was allergic to gluten, and taking out the gluten actually did help about 50%. But then he had a little ways to go. And as we took out animal products, including dairy, including eggs, we did find that he cleared up. But people are asking, why is it that there is a recurrence of allergies or little spots of eczema that come up? Is that dietary, and is there something else that they can do besides a whole food plant-based diet to decrease the amount of flare-ups that children or adults with eczema are having?
I really can't answer that. I'm not a clinician, so I haven't worked with patients like that, so I haven't seen that sort of thing. But your more general question has to do with the recurrence of allergic responses, I think, if I can put it that way.
Yes.
And so people have had some history, especially when they're young, some history of allergic responses, and let's say they cured it up. And your story is a great one, by the way, involving, was that your own child?
Yeah, that was our son. Yeah.
Yeah. And so starting off early, they may have, with the allergy that he suffered at that time, particularly if it was bad, and sounded like to me, the way you describe it, it was particularly serious, I think, for him, if I can say that. So, fortunately, he started changing things, and he really got quite well. It is possible that at times, maybe a little bit of that allergy will return because the body, in a sense, kind of remembers what it had before. And so I think someone like him and others like him are probably having a little extra sensitivity to that problem. And so something might sneak in from time to time to re-energize the problem, if you will. But again, I'm out of school on this, quite frankly, from not being in the clinic and seeing patients like this. So I can't answer for sure, but that's my best guess.
Thank you.
So I know a lot of what you do, well, everything you do is based on research, and you have brought so much to our lives personally, from the China study that came out in 2005, Forks Over Knives you were in 2011, your book Whole in 2013. All of these things had a huge impact on me personally, and taking your plant-based nutrition course as well, turning me from someone who had a tumor on his kidney to the tumor shrinking and just coming back to life, basically, through all of your research. My question is, first of all, thank you. But my question is, have there been any new research studies that have come up or developments over the last 5 or 6 years that we haven't yet learned about that you wish to share with us?
Well, I'm writing another book, as I mentioned before, actually on the next to the last chapter. And this story is about defining nutrition in a different way. Some of it is rather consistent with what I wrote in the book Whole, but elaborating a little bit further, on what that really means. That is really nature at work. That's the way I tend to look at it. So I'm really anxious to, and that's going to be new, I should say, for a lot of people. I mean, what I talked about in Whole was, I guess, new, and actually that's got a very good reception. I've already been hearing from universities wanting to use it for a textbook. in medical schools and things like that. That idea really resonates with people who have spent their lives, professionally in this sort of field, because they'll say things like, "Oh my gosh, I never really quite thought of it that way. You're absolutely right," et cetera, because it has a breadth of effect. By the way, your own story is very impressive. I hear those kind of stories often, and that's what what I was referring to in part before when I said it had such a breadth of effect. I continue to hear responses from people with all manner of problems, resolving their problems when they start doing it this way. And so that's why I like to say it's nature at work in a sense. So as far as something new is concerned, this book, I'm sure, is going to be considered by many people, especially people in the profession. It's quite new because it's essentially the opposite of what the science of nutrition has been for the last 150 years. As I mentioned before, if you go back in history, and that's what I'm doing with this book, I did go back into the history, did quite a lot of work on that all the way back to the 1700s, 1800s, and so forth. And the history is very informative because what was talked about in the late 1700s and up until mid to late 1800s was a concept somewhat like I'm talking about now, and it was rejected. It was pushed aside. And instead, what was adopted was, and incidentally, that first idea was called the constitutional nature of disease. And what the alternative was a concept called local theory of disease, constitutional versus local. I think you can probably understand, what the ramifications of that thought. But in any case, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when medical people, scientists, and medical people were beginning to get a little more interested in how to solve medical problems, they chose the wrong method. They chose the local theory of disease to explain virtually everything. Now we call that in the modern day reductionism. And when you take that approach, especially in science, there's a zillion things you can observe and see and somehow adopt and want to make use of it, especially if you can sell the idea. That's what our system has become. And what I'm arguing, and I think it will be new for a lot of people, is that we took the wrong path. It was extremely costly to our society. And I spent, as you probably know, about 20 years in policy development, formally, in Washington, London, Beijing, so forth, working at that level of helping to develop national guidelines, if you will, helping to try to resolve some of the tricky medical questions of the day. So I had firsthand experience with what goes on as we try to translate stuff coming out of the laboratory, for the public. At that level, at that interface, unfortunately, corporate interests become quite involved. And they want to shade whatever we might declare or decide that might be worth thinking about. Their corporate interests are very powerful. And so what ends up coming out for public information for the public, unfortunately, is tainted. I don't think I'm being too harsh. I know this is true. It's really tainted in favor of whatever they, want to espouse. They don't want scientists coming out and talking about things that might question their own products and services. Sorry, that was a long answer. But I think the notion of explaining how nutrition as a science has been misunderstood and, quite frankly, ignored or distorted, over the years. And just to illustrate one point, you may know there's not a medical school in North America or Europe, as far as I'm aware, that actually teaches nutrition as part of the medical program. They don't teach it. Yes, they'll offer a few classes. They call it nutrition, but that's not really nutrition. It's based on, for the most part, talking about basic biochemistry. And so medical schools, doctors are not trained in this topic. And that's a tragedy because of all the medical specialties. I consider this to be number one. And I should add one more point, that in the United States, there are presumably somewhere around 134 medical specialties, we call them. Medical specialties means the case where a patient comes in to see the doctor has to write down something if they want to get reimbursed. have to write down something, and they usually have a numbered code. They write the code down, and that triggers, the reimbursement, if you so, especially from government programs like Medicare or Medicaid. So the medical specialty business is a means by which professionals are reimbursed for their services. And of the 130 or so medical specialties, the number changes from time to time. Among those, there's not one called nutrition. There's not one. So doctors are not trained in nutrition. And then they're not able to be reimbursed for services if they choose. They want to go down that route. It's very difficult. And so I think it's such a fundamental concept that people tend not to know.
We're taking a break from this episode of the Plant Trainers Podcast. Hey, patrons, we wanted to give an extra shout out to tell you we appreciate how much you care. Because of your contributions, no matter how big or small, you've helped us to cover hosting and production costs, as well as give a bright young intern a chance to work with our compassionate company. For those of you who want to help support the show, support learning opportunities for young plant-based students and compassionate causes, you can do so at patreon.com/planttrainers or click the link in the show notes. And now back to the show.
So it's funny because this morning I saw a meme on the computer, and basically it's a doctor standing in front of a class teaching other doctors in his lab coat with a little ruler and pointing to the chalkboard, and on the chalkboard is written, "A patient cured is a customer lost." So, just to that point, there's possibly a reason why this is going the way that it's going, because if doctors want to have work on a daily basis, they need sick patients. I don't think that doctors themselves want their patients to be sick, but I think that that's the way that you're saying the system has been created.
Absolutely. You said it well, and that's a perfect illustration of what I'm talking about. I can add another sort of wrinkle to that. I happen to have gotten to know someone who was high up in the pharmaceutical industry and finally quit some, 7, 8 years ago, something like that. He said on Monday mornings when they get together, they would talk about, the creation of yet another sickness, maybe another medical specialty, because it's not a healthcare system we're talking about. It's a sick care system. And so the business depends on sickness. I hate to say it that way as well as you do. And I think it's really tragic that that's the way it's built, but that's where the money is. And so that's how it happens.
That's how it happens. And then, to the point that doctors don't have a lot of nutritional training, we see a lot of doctors prescribing more of a ketosis type of diet for a lot of patients. And we've talked about it in terms of diabetes many times before, and how carbohydrates can definitely support a diabetic in terms of getting better or eliminating diabetes completely. But now we're starting to see it for more of autoimmune disease as well. So even if it is more of a high-fat plant-based diet, is there any evidence supporting ketosis being a reasonable method for dealing with these diseases?
I'm going to say no, even though in the short term, specific cases people may see, somewhat looks like benefits that quite frankly don't last. Let me tell you a little story about the ketosis thing. I learned what ketones were as chemicals when I was only a freshman or sophomore, I can't remember, in undergraduate school. It was many years ago. One of the few things that were known at that time. And those chemicals tend to appear in people who become nauseated from drinking too much alcohol, for starters. That's one case. But in any case, as the years passed, these ketones, there's different versions of them, they tended to reflect a sickness. They tended to reflect some other stuff. And then eventually it was learned that they tend to appear when people are consuming really high animal protein diets, like the Atkins diet, for example. When the Atkins diet came out, with the emphasis on animal protein, if you will, and high fat as well, that tended to elevate the production of the ketone bodies. That, in turn, one of the properties of these agents, if you will, is to help to depress appetite. Okay? Kind of a short-term thing, but it depresses appetite for a bit. So what the Atkins people first saw when they heard about the book, if you will, when they first saw that, they said, oh, this will reduce weight. Well, sure enough, if people switch over to an Atkins diet, which is high protein, high fat, more ketones, in the process, they lose some weight. Pretty consistent. And so some people go on the Atkins diet, high protein, high fat, they tend to lose weight. And that was a heck of a selling point, obviously, for that whole concept. Go use the Atkins diet. I can lose weight. And that's the way Dr. Atkins advertised it. But then in turn, he also supported his program by telling people what kind of vitamin deficiencies they had. And he made a mint. By the way, Atkins never published a single peer-reviewed professional publication. Wife once said that he was proud of it. There's even some questions whether he even had an MD. But he just absolutely came forth with this idea of high protein, high fat diets. That was, more ketones, which in turn caused a suppression of appetite to some extent. And as I say, when he passed away from a heart attack, by the way, he had in his coffers something at least $100 million. So the story goes. Haven't seen that in writing. So the ketone thing has really hung around, or ketosis, which is reflecting the consumption of a high animal protein diet. It's a high animal protein, high fat diet. The idea that it's a plant-based diet, that is not a ketone diet. They may, if they're doing a plant-based diet, what they might be talking about, I can't be certain of this, they're probably taking the ketones, and preparing a pharmacologic preparation, maybe taking them as some kind of pharmaceutical preparation or supplement. And then in those particular cases, they may see some benefits in the short run because they're going to depress appetite. But I'm sure I can say this with as much certainty as I'm sure I'm sitting here, that taking that approach in long range will not work. And one way to sort of look at the evidence on that regard is simply to look at the evidence relating high protein diets, animal proteins, I should be specific, high animal protein diets to see how that relates to various and sundry diseases, cancers, heart disease, osteoporosis, autoimmune diseases, quite frankly. And what one sees there, and this is part of the book I'm writing now, I've gone back and actually gotten the charts on this to show this. It basically shows that the high animal protein diet across the board increases risk of disease for many different kinds of diseases. That's basically a ketone kind of diet, ketosis kind of diet, the high animal protein kind of diet. And so, but the people who want to sell something, they pull out the ketosis thing. Okay, let's talk about this alone and see some benefits and then sell something. It doesn't really work. There's a lot of versions of that. Atkins diet, as I'm sure you know, one of the first was the South Beach diet. Mm-hmm. Heard some stories there about how that started off with a $5 million grant or donation from a group who wanted to sort of refute what, for example, I was talking about, and others like myself. So the South Beach diet was one thing, and then what they said, and that came out about the time Dr. Atkins passed away. And the story was to sell that idea. Oh, this is an Atkins diet, but we have more vegetables and fruits, to try to tell people that they were doing something right. But it was nothing more than the Atkins type of diet. And then came along another diet called the Zone diet. You may have heard of that. Barry Sears, a pharmacologic technician, actually wasn't, or a technical person. He had the same thing. When you're in the zone, which means you're feeling well, you should be eating a high animal protein diet. And then there was, still after that, there was other books that came out. Was it Protein Power was one of them was called. Another was called the Paleo Diet. That's the version at present that's gotten the most attention by far. The Paleo Diet is nothing more, too, than a ketone diet or a high animal protein diet. In the book itself, the author was advocating something less. The author also was agreeing that dairy should not be consumed. That was one to his credit. But his specialty was exercise science. It was not in the area of nutrition. I've debated him 3 times, sort of, and he doesn't want to do it anymore. He tries to say he's saying the same thing I do, and I tell him, no, you're not. And it's really comes out as it's represented in the public marketplace as the latest, best kind of dietary thing, as I'm sure you've heard, for all sorts of different reasons, marketing tricks, when in reality, it's nothing more than a high-protein, high-fat diet.
And so these high protein diets, they also provide us with all this calcium to help prevent osteoporosis, don't they? You mentioned osteoporosis before, so
Right.
can you just clarify that and explain how a whole food plant-based diet is going to be more beneficial than taking in all that animal protein?
Great. I think that was on the online course. I'm not sure, but you might have picked it up there. But in any case, it's been clearly shown. It's so clear that the dairy industry is beginning to back away from that claim. And what I'm saying, what was clearly shown, is that if you compare calcium intake in different countries versus what is generally regarded as bone fracture rate, which is osteoporosis essentially, if you compare calcium intake versus those bone problems, the higher the calcium intake, the greater the bone fracture rate, not the lower. At the same time, there's other studies, one in particular came out in 1992 from Yale University, that showed that a very strong relationship between animal protein consumption and bone fracture rate. So you got here you have two entities, nutritionally speaking, calcium and animal protein. When you consume more calcium, more animal protein simultaneously, then you have a greater fracture rate. More osteoporosis. In other words, in shorthand, that means the more dairy people consume, the higher the osteoporosis. It's very clear. And I think I've been talking about that for some time. I actually been told that some of my stuff that I've talked about is really has had quite an impact on the dairy. And I think they are backing away from that. I'm pretty sure of that. They may occasionally say it, but they don't tend to say it like they said years ago. More calcium is not advocated. A plant-based diet, whole food plant-based diet especially, contains calcium at the level of an average around, I would say 300 to 500, look at different countries, somewhere in that territory, milligrams per day. And in reality, what ended up was, what was recommended was 1,000 per day by an agency in this country that makes dietary recommendations. That in turn was influenced by the dairy industry. So it's been that way for now some years, and I think we're beginning to turn that story around. I really believe that's true.
Yeah. And so someone who may have osteoporosis, is it possible for their bones to rebuild on a whole food plant-based diet?
Very good question. I can talk about one person. It's Ruth Heydrich is her name. She was a colonel in the Navy, actually, as one of the first women to hold that title back when she was in her 30s and 40s or something like that. And then she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And she was obviously worried about that. And she was one of the early people in this whole movement. She went to a plant-based diet. And what was interesting is that going from 40 to 50 or late 50s, and during that period, she was worried about not getting enough calcium, if you will. She also turned to be an athlete, and she became a really excellent athlete during that period. Her breast cancer did not progress, that she was diagnosed with. And so during that period of time, she was becoming ever more athletic. She was feeling much better. She was not getting calcium. And so just to be careful about that calcium question, she had her bone density checked. And believe it or not, the bone density for women in that age, during menopause, for example, tends to go down for virtually all women. And that's a risk factor itself. But so it tends to go down. In her case, the bone density actually went up a bit. And I know the story quite well. I know her. I had her come to Cornell to lecture to my class on that subject. So speaking, I guess, from firsthand knowledge is what she has told me. And she's now in her 80s. And she spent the rest of her life so far running marathons, things like that.
Yeah, we've reached out to her before and connected with her before, but haven't had an opportunity to speak with her one-on-one. So I'm wondering if she's the only evidence that you have right now because there's been research that hasn't been able to prove it, or because there hasn't been research in that area.
I first want, yes, I haven't seen that research that makes that claim, but the first thing I want to do when people make those kind of claims, especially if they come out in the newspaper, public media, or on the internet, I want to go to the original study. to see what kind of study design they may have used. That's important. And their study designs, experimental study designs, if you will, are different, and they give somewhat different answers sometimes, it appears to be. But it really relates to the way in which the question was asked and how they collected the data. So that's a critical question, actually, as I say, that's a critical thing to look at the first time I hear claims of that sort. In fact, I'm going to do that after we finish up, see what I can find. And as far as reversing the disease is concerned, I can't say that's going to, my own thought on that. I don't know it having been reversed, actually, because that's a normal process for women in particular, but men also. When menopause comes along, the level of estrogen, circulating estrogen in their blood declines fairly rapidly. And that, as that goes down, that's considered to be to some extent a risk factor for osteoporosis, because the estrogen tends to protect bones. That's the reductionist point of view. So as estrogen tends to decline, then there's some risk for bone density to decline with it. But that's for people who are accustomed to consuming high calcium, high animal protein diets. If a woman is on, let's say, a whole food plant-based diet up until that time, they don't have as high a level of estrogen to fall as far, if I can say it that way. And so it gradually comes down. That's part of nature. Under those circumstances, we don't tend to see osteoporosis. So as far as reversal is concerned, to go back to your question, the fact that it tends to go down at that period of one's life does not mean reversal, because if they got into that stage, where just on a plant-based diet, they already have strong bones and they're in good shape.
We can slow down the process, or we can see it having later onset, but because it is a natural process of the body, there might not be extreme reversal or even need for it to be as extreme as it was going to be with a standard North American diet.
Right. You said it right. As far as I want to add one qualifier. As someone comes into that age, it depends on what kind of diet they have been on for their life. Mm-hmm. If they have been on a high animal protein, high calcium, high dairy kind of diet, the story is a little bit different, because that'll drop pretty fast. And that's something that leads to, I think, this is in that category of thinking, it leads to the higher risk for hot flashes and other, discomforts at that age, as the estrogen is dropping rather rapidly. That's one thing. And also, as it drops so rapidly like that, you can just imagine that person is at a little more risk of some discomfort or harm.
And for males as well, with the whole estrogen?
Yeah. Well, not the estrogen with males. I mean, the males do have about 5 to 10% of the estrogen levels as women, estradiol in particular. So it's not as high. And then reverse is true. Women have testosterone at low levels. So there's always a balance. And this is another area of science that hasn't been fully worked out. We shouldn't get too carried away with specifics on this, but the last I saw, there's at least 43 different kinds of estrogens, for example. And on top of that, testosterone is one of a kind, but it's androgen, and there's different kinds of androgens. On top of that, these hormones, male or female, travel through the blood. And they are carried on a protein called sex hormone binding globulin. And so the level of sex hormone binding globulin in the blood also plays a role in all of this. So it gets pretty complicated. But again, nature seems to know what it's doing. Because if we come into that period of time, males or females, let's say, we don't have the same evidence on males, but they're already a pretty good healthy state at that point, if you will. Hormone levels are kind of balanced out pretty nicely, probably. And so they can move into that older age with little or no discomfort. I saw that when I was working a lot in China years ago on our study there. I had an opportunity to learn from my colleagues in medicine in China who, were inclined to certainly be familiar with and largely practiced Eastern medicine. I learned a lot. And that's where I got some of my ideas on holism, because that's what that is. And they were talking at that time. I remember one of the questions I asked was, to what extent do women have this difficulty, at menopause? And there was much less of that. They hardly knew what it was. It was very interesting. That's just anecdotal experiment. That's not published, but.
Right. But it definitely gives us an outlook of where we can go next with studies and articles published. Dr. Campbell, we are so grateful for your time today. And just before we let you go, we wanted to know if you had one statement, one message for the masses, what would you like people to hear?
Nutrition as a science is the most important medical science of all. And it's not even a medical specialty. It is the most important, a premier medical science of all. If we could say that out loud, blare it out there.
We're gonna Adam, when you edit this, can you make that louder in everybody's ear?
I'll make it clear.
You'll make it clear. Perfect.
Thank you. Can I make one more comment? Center for Nutrition Studies with the course. I sent that email to you.
Yes.
We're adding more courses to that, by the way, especially on food and the environment. That'll be coming up soon. Very excited about it. But there's one more thing I'd like to advocate, if you will. It's a group of. It's called. It started with the film PlantPure Nation that my oldest son was the director of, working with the same producer, John Corey, who was a producer for Forks Over Knives. And Forks Over Knives really did start with a China study. So PlantPure Nation is a film, was in theaters for a while, now on YouTube. But out of that film intervention, that idea, my oldest son then developed first he developed a line of foods, sort of marketplace to do the right thing. But more importantly, he's got now more than 500 wellness groups in North America and abroad. I think it's about 43 countries. It's called PlantPure Nation. And I forget whether it's .com or .org, I can't remember. But there's a nonprofit component to it. And these 500 wellness groups are called pods, and they are getting to be everywhere. And the concept is that that's one way to spread the message, because these individual local groups do various and sundry things, maybe just nothing more than dish to pass to other, more sophisticated kind of things. They communicate with each other, that sort of thing. That's the idea.
Are you talking about Tom? Is that who was doing that?
This is Nelson.
Oh, Nelson. Okay.
The younger one, our youngest son, he's a physician. I didn't know you knew about him, but yeah, he was active in our website. In our online program, of course. Tom now has got a nice position at a major medical center. He's the medical director, in fact, of a program that has been given free license to really start pushing the idea of PlantPure Nation in a major medical school. It's really great. And he's doing research, organizing a research program, which is a component of what we do in the online course. In fact, we're providing funding for that effort that he's now doing. And he's got 2 studies now underway. Well, I'm sure one is underway, the other is being proposed. One study is using a whole food plant-based diet to reverse or to treat women with metastatic breast cancer. That's probably the most difficult of all, and we'll see what happens. That's underway. He's recruiting women for that. The other study, he's studying the effect of the whole food plant-based diet as such on kidney disease, which is one of the most expensive diseases we have to experience, in our society. So he's got a research program going. That's Tom. Nelson has got his food on the marketplace. One of the major food companies has now put it on their shelves, and he's got the online the PlantPure, the pod thing that I mentioned before.
Yeah, we had Tom on our podcast on episode 131, and we're going to link in our show notes to PlantPure Nation so people could find Nelson's work. And of course, we'll link to nutritionstudies.org so people that are interested in educating themselves on whole food plant-based nutrition, they'll be able to look at that certification program that you offer and keep up to date on any new courses that do come out. And of course, we'll link to all your books in the show notes at planttrainers.com.
Right. Well, thank you very much. It's all about anything. What you guys are doing is great. Anyone who's in this business of, trying to educate the public, if you will, that's a really, really socially responsible thing to do. I think it's a big problem in many ways, and we need to solve it. We need to work.
Our goal is just to help people improve their quality of life through nutrition and fitness so that they can start thriving, because just surviving is not enough, and too many people are in that boat.
You said it well. Yeah.
Thank you so much again for your time. It's been an honor.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this edition of the Plant Trainers Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or any other podcast listening platforms. We appreciate the feedback we receive from you. Every time we get a 5-star rating or review on iTunes from one of our fans, it ensures other people will find us too. Thanks to our patrons. To become a patron, visit www.patreon.com/planttrainers. Even supporting us with $1 really makes a difference. Connect and follow us on Instagram and Twitter @PlantTrainers. Like Plant Trainers on Facebook, join our newsletter, and check out our website at www.planttrainers.com for awesome plant-based recipes and a list of our services. Email your questions to info@planttrainers.com so we can answer them on our upcoming Facebook Lives. We hope we've inspired you today. Join us again next time, and have a healthy day.